It was late in the fall of 2014 when I found myself driving through the dense woods of northern Michigan. The days had shortened, and the nights were colder, marking the slow transition into winter. I had just moved back to the Midwest from a year of working in the bustling city of Chicago, seeking solace after a turbulent period in my life. My wife had passed away earlier that year, and after months of grappling with grief and the remnants of our once shared life, I decided that a trip up to my uncle's old cabin would help clear my mind. The cabin had always been a place of comfort for me. My uncle Jerry had built it back in the 80s, a small, cozy structure tucked away on the edge of a large, secluded forest. He'd left it to me in his will, though I hadn't really made use of it since his passing. The whole place felt like a relic, its wood floors creaking underfoot, and its old, weathered windows always looking out toward the wilderness. It was perfect for solitude. As I approached the cabin, the sun had already set behind the thick canopy of trees, casting long shadows over the winding dirt road. The headlights of my truck cut through the gloom, illuminating the trail ahead. A sense of unease settled over me. I wasn't used to being so far out in the middle of nowhere anymore. The city had spoiled me with its noise, lights, and constant motion. But here it was just silence, complete, unnerving silence. I pulled up the gravel drive to the cabin, which stood quietly in the clearing. The place was almost exactly as I remembered it, save for the overgrowth of weeds and a few fallen branches littering the yard. The roof was sagging slightly, and the paint had faded, but it still exuded that same rustic charm. A perfect retreat from the world, I told myself. I got out of the truck, grabbed my duffel bag, and made my way to the porch. The air smelled earthy and crisp, the scent of pine needles and damp wood filling my lungs. The chill of autumn wrapped around me, and for a moment, I felt a strange sense of relief. It was good to be away from everything. Inside, I flicked the light switch by the door, and the old cabin groaned as it came to life. The place smelled musty, like old furniture and stale air, but nothing too unpleasant. The living room, small and functional, still had the leather armchair my uncle used to sit in by the fire, and the fireplace itself was intact, though it hadn't been used in some time. I set my things down on the couch and began unpacking. My uncle's old hunting photos were still on the walls, and the shelves were lined with dusty books. I stood there for a while, taking it all in, feeling a weird mix of nostalgia and sadness. This place held so many memories of better times. As the night deepened, I decided to start a fire in the hearth. The logs crackled and popped as the flames began to dance, casting warm, flickering shadows around the room. I sat in the armchair, the one my uncle had always claimed as his, and stared into the fire. My mind wandered, replaying moments from the past. Memories of my wife, moments of laughter, the long drives we used to take to this very cabin. It felt so distant now, as if I was looking at someone else's life. The night grew colder, and I grabbed a blanket from the couch, wrapping it around my shoulders. The wind howled outside, rattling the cabin's old windows. I pulled my feet up onto the chair, trying to make myself comfortable, but something wasn't right. The air seemed thicker, heavier, and the shadows outside seemed to stretch longer than they should. The wind, which had been a constant companion since I'd arrived, started to pick up. It wasn't just a breeze now. It was a gusting, howling wind that rattled the walls of the cabin. I didn't think much of it at first. After all, this wasn't the first time I'd been in this cabin when a storm hit. I had grown up in a house just like this one, in the middle of nowhere, and it was common for the wind to pick up at night in the fall. But then, just as I was starting to drift off to sleep, I heard something that made my heart race. A knock. It was soft at first, like the tap of a branch against the window. But then it came again, louder, and then a third time, louder still. I froze, my mind racing. There was no one out here. I hadn't seen a single car on the road when I drove in. This part of the woods was isolated, far from any other cabins or houses. The nearest neighbor was a good mile away. It was almost absurd to think that someone would be out here at this hour, in the middle of a storm. I got up, slowly, walking toward the window by the front door. The wind had picked up even more, howling through the trees, making the night feel even darker. I peered out through the fogged glass, but there was nothing, just the deep black of the forest stretching out beyond the porch. I thought it might have been an animal, a deer or something like that, bumping into the cabin. It wasn't unheard of for wildlife to get close to the house, especially in the colder months when food was scarcer. But then, I heard it again, a sharp, deliberate knock coming from the back door. My blood ran cold. The back door. I hadn't heard anyone approach the cabin. No footsteps, no rustling, nothing. I glanced at the old shotgun that hung on the wall beside the fireplace. My uncle had always kept it there, just in case. I'd never felt the need to use it before, but tonight felt different. I grabbed the gun, checked the safety, and made my way toward the back door. The cabin was silent again, but I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. My breath seemed unnaturally loud in my ears as I crept toward the door. My mind raced with possibilities. Maybe it was some sort of hunter, someone lost in the woods, or maybe it was someone looking for shelter. But even as I tried to reason with myself, a gnawing sense of unease settled over me. When I reached the back door, I hesitated. The wind was louder here, the trees outside thrashing against each other as if they were angry. My fingers trembled as I reached for the handle, but before I could turn it, the knock came again. This time, it wasn't a tap on the door. It was a forceful, deliberate bang, followed by a moment of silence. I swung the door open, pointing the shotgun out into the night. Nothing. The porch was empty, save for the swirling wind and a few scattered leaves tumbling across the wood. My eyes scanned the darkness, searching for any sign of movement, any trace of life. But the forest was still, and the only sound was the howling wind. I stepped outside, the cold air biting into my skin. I kept the shotgun at the ready, but there was no one around. The world felt impossibly quiet. I looked around, confused and uneasy, trying to make sense of what was happening. Had I imagined it? Had I been hearing things? Just then, I heard it again, a faint rustling from behind the cabin. My eyes snapped to the back corner, where a cluster of trees grew thick and dark. I knew every inch of this property, and there was no reason for someone to be out there. But as I stared into the inky blackness of the woods, I saw something moving. A shadow, perhaps, but something was definitely there. My heart leapt in my chest. Without thinking, I stepped forward, moving around the side of the cabin to get a better look. The sound was getting louder now, closer. Whatever it was moving swiftly through the brush, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it was closing in on me. Then, in a flash, something burst out of the trees. A figure, tall and thin, moving fast. I fired. The shot rang out, echoing through the forest, and the figure dropped. I heard a thud as it hit the ground, followed by an eerie silence. I rushed over, my heart pounding, and found a man lying motionless on the ground, his eyes wide open and staring. He wasn't moving. I knelt down, breathless, and checked for a pulse. There was none. For a moment, I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Who was he? What had he been doing out here, alone, in the middle of the woods at this time of night? And why had he come so close to my cabin? I stood up, backing away, still trying to make sense of everything. The air seemed to crackle with tension as I scanned the woods around me. There was no sign of anyone else. As I made my way back to the cabin, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right, that someone else was watching me. But when I reached the door and looked back, there was nothing, only the dark, silent woods. I locked the door behind me, trembling, and sat down in the armchair by the fire. The rest of the night was uneventful, the storm outside continuing to rage. But I couldn't escape the unsettling feeling that something was out there, something I hadn't seen. The next morning, I went back outside to find the body gone. There were no signs of a struggle, no trace of blood. It was as if he had never been there at all. I searched the woods for hours, but found nothing. Maybe I had imagined it all, I thought. Maybe it was just the isolation, the loneliness that had gotten to me. But deep down, I knew better. There was something in those woods, something that I hadn't fully understood yet. I'd left the cabin behind, but that night would never leave me, not for as long as I lived. And I still wonder, sometimes, if the man was just one piece of a much larger puzzle, something that I might never fully understand. I took a seasonal job in Vermont back in the fall of 2016. I had just turned 37, and after going through a divorce earlier that year, I needed to get away from everything. City life had worn me thin. I had worked in a machine shop for over a decade, and when I left, I didn't take much with me. My ex kept the apartment, and I packed what I could into my truck and started driving. I didn't really have a plan at first. Just the idea of finding work in quieter parts of the country, staying mobile, and living lean. A few weeks into my wandering, I found an online post for a groundskeeper position in a rural part of Vermont. It was one of those no-frills listings, just a short paragraph saying they needed someone to maintain a private family graveyard and an old cabin on the property. They offered a place to stay and a modest paycheck. It didn't sound ideal, but it was quiet, far away, and gave me something to do. The property was owned by a man named Harold Dayton, though I never met him in person. Everything was handled through his assistant over the phone and email. The graveyard, she explained, had been in the Dayton family since the early 1800s. It wasn't open to the public, just private land, tucked away near a dead-end dirt road about 8 miles outside a small town called Brookvale. There was a one-room log cabin on the edge of the woods beside the graveyard. That was where I'd be staying. When I got there, it was early October. The leaves had started changing, and the air was already turning cold. The road leading to the property was rough, half washed out in places. My truck barely made it up the last incline without spinning out. The area felt forgotten, like nobody had been back there in years. That was probably true, aside from whoever checked on the graves once in a while. The cabin was small but dry. No power, no running water, just a wood stove, a metal bed frame, a desk, a small table, and a busted bookshelf. The assistant told me they'd bring supplies once a week, mostly food, water jugs, and fuel for the stove. I was expected to rake leaves, keep the paths clear, do basic repairs to the fence surrounding the graveyard, and document any weather damage or vandalism, though none had ever been reported. The graveyard itself sat maybe 30 yards from the cabin. It wasn't very big. Maybe 24 old stone markers, some barely legible, all arranged in loose rows under a canopy of old birch and maple trees. The fence around it was rusted iron, waist-high, with a creaky gate that never quite latched right. Moss clung to almost every surface, and the whole place had a damp, heavy smell to it. Not rotting, just old and full of soaked earth. The first couple of days were uneventful. I swept the leaves from the paths, cut back overgrown brush, and patched part of the fence where it had bent from a fallen branch. The nights were quiet, dead quiet, no traffic.
No dogs barking.
No people, just the occasional owl or the soft knock of trees shifting in the wind. That silence grew heavier as the days passed. I started to feel it in my chest at night. I couldn't explain it at the time, but it was like the quiet had weight. It pressed against the walls of the cabin. I didn't sleep much, even with the stove going. I'd lie there listening to the woods, sometimes hearing something snap or shuffle in the leaves outside. But it never sounded close, just far-off movement. Still, I kept a hatchet by the bed. About a week in, I noticed something strange. I was raking behind the far row of graves when I saw one of the stones looked different. Not the stone itself, but the earth around it. The ground near the base looked darker than the rest, like it had been disturbed. At first I thought maybe it was runoff from the last rain, but the soil was loose. It hadn't been packed down by years of settling. I poked at it with a stick. The top layer gave easily, revealing fresher, lighter dirt underneath. I figured maybe an animal had been digging, maybe a fox or a raccoon, but it didn't look like the kind of shallow pawing animals usually do. It was too clean, like someone had used a small shovel. There were even spots that looked like the corners of a rectangular hole had been started but not finished. That stuck with me. Couldn't let it go. The next day, I came back with a small hand spade from the supply bin near the cabin. I dug a few inches down. Sure enough, the dirt was loose and clearly disturbed, but no bones or anything like that. I didn't want to go deeper. Felt wrong. So I covered it back up and moved on. A couple days later, something even stranger happened. I was doing rounds around the edge of the woods, just making sure no trees had come down near the graveyard fence, when I spotted something off to the side. A patch of disturbed ground a good 50 yards into the trees. I walked over, and sure enough, there was a small hole there too. Same kind of digging pattern, rectangular, just a few inches deep, not animal-like at all. There was no reason for someone to be out here. This was private land. The road was barely drivable. Nobody had any business being out in those woods. And yet the pattern kept repeating. Over the next week, I found 3 more shallow holes, each one carefully shaped, like someone had started digging but stopped after the first few scoops. None of them were more than a foot deep, always in a clean rectangle, always fresh. I reported it in my weekly log that I emailed to the assistant. Never got a reply about it. One night, maybe 2 weeks into my stay, I woke up around 2:30 in the morning. I hadn't heard anything, but something felt off. My skin prickled. I got up, threw on my coat, and stepped outside with a flashlight. The cold hit me hard. My breath came out in heavy clouds. The woods looked calm, but I had that same feeling, like the silence was crawling up my spine. I swept the beam across the tree line and almost missed it, movement, low to the ground, ducking behind a bush. I stood there, frozen, my ears ringing from the cold and tension. Then I heard it, dirt being moved, a soft shuffling sound, maybe 20 feet off the path behind the graves. I didn't call out. I didn't move. I just stood and listened. The sound went on for maybe another 30 seconds, then stopped completely. The next morning, I went to check. There was a fresh hole, same shape, maybe 6 inches deep, right near one of the older graves. I checked the fence. No sign of it being opened or climbed. Whatever or whoever was doing this was getting in some other way. I started sleeping during the day, staying up at night. I kept the fire low, kept the lights off. I sat near the small window that looked toward the graveyard and just watched. Every night for the next 4 nights, I saw movement. Low figures moving through the trees. Never close enough to make out faces. They stayed in the shadows, always digging, never staying longer than an hour. I never saw more than one at a time, but I couldn't tell if it was the same person or different ones. One night, I followed them. I waited until the shape moved past the far fence corner. Then I crept out. I kept my flashlight off and followed at a distance, my boots barely touching the ground. They didn't make much noise, but I could see them, tall, lean, maybe wearing a hooded coat. They stopped in a small clearing and started digging again. I waited, heart pounding, unsure what I'd do. But after a minute, they stopped and just stood there, facing the hole, not moving, just standing still. Then they turned and looked directly toward me. I ducked behind a tree, heart in my throat. After a minute, I peeked again. They were gone. I ran back to the cabin and didn't leave until morning. After that, I wrote a letter to the assistant and left it with the next supply drop. I told them I wanted to end my contract early. I didn't give a full explanation, just said I wasn't comfortable and that there was suspicious activity on the grounds. I never heard back. On my last night, I stayed awake, packed and ready. Around 3 a.m., I heard something hit the cabin wall. A soft thump, then another. I grabbed the hatchet and crept to the window. There were two figures this time, both standing just beyond the graveyard fence. Not moving, just staring at the cabin. I didn't sleep. I sat with my back against the wall until the sun came up. When it did, the figures were gone, but their footprints were still in the frost-covered grass. Clean boot prints, adult size. I left that morning and never went back. A few months later, I checked the local news archives online. Nothing came up about the property, but I did find something strange in the town records. A short article, dated years before my stay, mentioned that the Dayton family had tried to donate the land to the county, but the deal fell through because of land use complications. One line stood out: asterisk, the property was previously evaluated as unsuitable for public development due to multiple undocumented burials found outside the established cemetery boundary. Asterisk, I don't know what I was watching those nights. Maybe grave robbers, maybe something worse, but it wasn't ghosts. It was real people, real shovels.
Real graves.
Someone was digging for something or someone, and they didn't care who saw them. All I know is, I'll never go near that part of Vermont again. And if someone offers you a job looking after an old graveyard in the woods, turn it down, especially if there's a cabin. The last thing I wanted to do that summer was spend time at my uncle's old farm cabin. But there I was, reluctantly packing up my car with the bare essentials for what I was told would be a quiet weekend to recharge. My uncle had passed away a few months earlier, and after the funeral, the property was left to his kids, my cousins, who were too busy with their own lives to even think about the cabin. So, they asked me, the only one in the family who seemed remotely willing to handle it, to keep an eye on the place. The cabin was tucked away about 2 hours outside of town in a part of the country that most people wouldn't think twice about. A few neighbors dotted the area, but nothing so close that you'd feel like you were in a community. It was the kind of place you drove through and thought, this is it, no one around for miles. And that's exactly what I was in for. When I arrived, the afternoon was still bright, but the heavy humidity in the air made everything feel thick. The kind of weather that made you want to sweat the moment you stepped outside. The cabin itself, with its creaky wooden walls and worn-out windows, was as I remembered it. Sturdy but ancient, with signs of age showing at every corner. The porch sagged a bit under the weight of years, and the faded red paint on the door was peeling. It had character. Too much of it, perhaps. I got out of my car, grabbing my bag, and stood there for a moment, taking in the quiet. It felt different without my uncle's presence, though I couldn't put my finger on why. Maybe it was the silence. It was so quiet that it almost felt unnatural. After bringing my things inside and settling into the small but cozy living room, I started unpacking. The place wasn't as bad as I'd imagined. A few old family photos, a small fireplace, and a collection of hunting trophies my uncle had proudly displayed. But there was something off about the way everything was arranged, as if it had been disturbed recently, but no one had lived there for months. My uncle was a meticulous man, always keeping his place in perfect order. This felt like someone had rifled through everything, even though there was no sign of forced entry. I decided to stay the night anyway. It was too late to drive back, and the thought of dealing with the hassle of the road again seemed exhausting. I'd just take it easy, have a drink, and get a good night's sleep. But as the evening wore on, the oppressive silence only grew heavier. It wasn't just the lack of sound. It was the way the quiet seemed to settle into my bones, making everything feel still, unnervingly still. I made myself dinner, the kind of basic meal I could throw together without much thought. But even while I ate, I kept glancing around. I was aware of every creak the floorboards made under my feet, every whiff of stale air that seemed to seep in from the corners of the cabin. It wasn't a haunting feeling, not quite that. It was more like the cabin itself was alive, breathing in rhythm with me, watching. As the sun dipped below the horizon and the dark crept in, I turned on the old radio. The hum of static was oddly comforting, something familiar in a place that felt anything but. I finished my meal and, feeling uneasy, decided to lock all the windows and doors, just to be safe. That's when the first strange thing happened. I was standing in the kitchen, washing dishes, when I heard a faint noise outside, a rustling. It wasn't the wind, it was too deliberate. Someone moving. I froze, the dish in my hand still dripping water. My heart began to race. I told myself it was probably an animal, a deer or maybe even a raccoon. I had no reason to assume the worst. Still, I waited for a few more seconds, straining to hear. Another rustling, and then a soft, deliberate knock at the door. I froze again. No animal knocked. It didn't make sense. No one lived for miles. The neighbors were far enough away that it wouldn't be easy to just pop by, especially not this late. I glanced at the clock. 9:30 p.m. Too late for anyone to be calling. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. Maybe it was just a prank, a random traveler or someone who had lost their way. I slowly walked over to the door, not daring to open it, but standing in front of it, looking out the small crack between the curtains. The porch was empty. The sound of the rustling stopped, as if whoever was there had simply disappeared. But there was still something in the air, a lingering presence. I closed the curtains and locked the door again, bolting it just in case. My mind raced with possibilities, trying to make sense of what I had just heard. Was it an animal? Was someone out there? I thought about calling my cousin to check if they had any idea who might be around, but that seemed excessive. It was probably nothing. The rest of the night felt off. Every sound, every creak, every sudden shift of air made me tense up. My mind was no longer focused on relaxing. Sleep eluded me as I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if I was just imagining things. Maybe the silence was getting to me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. At some point, exhaustion overtook me, and I finally drifted off into a restless sleep. I woke up the next morning with a start. The sun was up, and the cabin was bathed in light. Everything seemed normal at first. No strange noises, no knocks at the door. I forced myself to get out of bed and start my day, trying to shake off the odd feeling from last night. I went outside to check the perimeter of the cabin. The area around it was overgrown, with tall grass and thick brush near the back of the property. It seemed like no one had come around in a while. The dirt path leading to the cabin was barely visible. As I walked further into the woods behind the cabin, I noticed something strange. The ground near the back fence was disturbed. A patch of dirt was scratched up, like someone had been digging or moving around there recently. My heart skipped a beat. I knew for sure no one had been there before. My uncle had been a recluse, and he didn't entertain guests, especially not in his later years. I bent down to get a closer look. There were no clear footprints, just the disturbed earth. As I stood there, trying to make sense of it, I heard a noise behind me, a twig snapping. I whirled around, but no one was there. I wasn't alone. I spent the rest of the day double-checking all the locks and windows. I kept thinking about the knocking from the night before and the strange disturbance outside. Something or someone was out there. I couldn't stay here alone. I knew I had to leave, but the fear of what was waiting for me in the woods paralyzed me. I spent the rest of the evening in a heightened state of anxiety, waiting for something, anything to happen, but nothing did. At some point, after another long, sleepless night, I decided to leave. I grabbed my things and packed my car, driving away from the cabin as fast as I could. As I passed through the small, overgrown lane leading out of the property, I caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye, a figure standing just beyond the trees watching me. I didn't stop. I didn't slow down. I drove straight back to town, my heart pounding in my chest. The image of the figure haunted me. Who had been out there? What had they been doing? When I got home, I tried to put it all behind me. I didn't tell anyone what happened. No one would believe it anyway. But as I sat down, exhausted and shaken, I couldn't escape the feeling that someone, was still out there, waiting. The cabin, once a quiet, familiar place, would never feel safe to me again. It was the end of September 2017 when I got a call from my cousin Martin. He asked if I could house sit his hunting cabin in eastern Oregon, about 3 hours from where I lived in Redmond. He and his wife were going to fly to Texas for a funeral, and he needed someone to keep an eye on the place for a week. He was worried about local kids breaking in, stealing his gear, and messing with his generator. I'd just gotten laid off from my warehouse job the week before, so I didn't exactly have a full schedule. The cabin was deep in the woods near a small, 2-lane road called Joplin Creek Trail, not far from an old logging route that hadn't been maintained in years. You wouldn't find the place on Google Maps. It was the kind of land you had to know how to get to, or you'd miss it completely. Martin had been hunting up there since we were teenagers. He'd bought the land after a good run working as a contractor in Alaska and built the place by hand. I told him sure. I needed the quiet, and I figured some time away from town would do me good. I packed a week's worth of clothes, food, and my old bolt-action rifle, just in case, and drove up that Sunday morning. It was cloudy when I left, and by the time I reached the last few miles of dirt road, it had started to drizzle. Martin's directions were still good. I followed the trail until I found the fallen log he'd mentioned, then made the left into the clearing where the cabin sat. It was a single-story log cabin with a tin roof and a metal chimney sticking up like a crooked finger. The front porch had a few steps missing, and there were deer skulls nailed above the doorway, just like I remembered from the last time I'd been there 3 years ago. The inside was simple. One big open room with a fireplace on one wall, a wood stove for cooking, and a small cot in the corner. Martin had electricity from a generator out back, but no running water. You used a hand pump out near the shed if you wanted to fill up a bucket. I didn't mind. I liked that it was quiet. That first day I just got settled in. I checked the locks on the doors and windows, tested the generator, and stacked firewood near the fireplace. I had brought a few books, and I planned to just relax, fish a little, maybe do some hiking. It was just supposed to be a quiet, disconnected week in the woods. But it wasn't. The first night passed without anything strange. I heard animals moving in the trees, but that was normal. The second night was colder. I built a fire and made soup over the wood stove. Around midnight, I thought I heard something outside. Not animals this time, more like footsteps on the gravel near the shed. I turned off the lights inside and stood still. The fire crackled quietly behind me. I waited, listening. A long pause, then footsteps again, crunching softly. Not fast, not running, just walking. The kind of sound a person makes when they don't want to be heard but aren't in a rush. I grabbed my rifle and opened the door slowly. The night air was cold and smelled like wet pine. I stepped out onto the porch, the boards creaking under my boots. I scanned the yard with my flashlight, sweeping it past the shed, the trees, and the pump. Nothing. No footprints, no animals, no movement. I waited a while longer, then went back inside, locked the door. I told myself it was probably a deer or an elk, maybe a bear. Still, I left the rifle loaded and close to the cot. On the third day, I found something strange near the edge of the clearing. I was walking a trail Martin had cut with his ATV a few summers back, heading toward a small stream about half a mile from the cabin. I figured I'd try fishing, see if anything was biting, but maybe 100 yards down the trail, I noticed something in the mud. Footprints, not boot prints, bare feet, human clearly, but they were odd, wide, flat, and too long for someone normal. They weren't child-sized either. These were adult, easily the size of mine, maybe even longer, and they were fresh. The rain had stopped early that morning, and the mud still looked wet around the edges. Who the hell walks barefoot this far into the woods? I stood there staring at them for a long time. They led from the trees across the trail and disappeared into the underbrush. I looked around. Nothing. Not a sound, no movement. I felt exposed, standing there with my back open to the woods, so I turned and headed back to the cabin. I didn't sleep much that night. Every sound outside made me sit up. Around 2 a.m., I heard something knock against the cabin wall. A dull, slow thump. Once, then again from the other side. I got up, turned off the lights, and crouched near the window. The moonlight lit up the clearing just enough to see the trees and the outline of the shed. I waited. Another thump, lower this time, like it was near the ground. I stayed crouched like that until dawn. When the sun finally came up, I went outside with the rifle and circled the cabin. That's when I saw the marks, scratches, on the wood near the bottom of the wall. Deep grooves like someone had run a blade or a rock along the logs. They weren't random either. They were spaced almost evenly, like whoever did it had scraped in a pattern. By day 5, I was on edge constantly. I barely left the cabin. I kept the rifle close and slept in my boots, waking up at every creak of the roof or rustle of the trees. The worst part wasn't that I was scared. It was that I didn't know what I was scared of. If someone was messing with me, why wouldn't they just come to the door and try something? Why scratch the walls and walk barefoot around the woods? That morning I found something else. A dead rabbit. Not eaten, not torn apart like a predator would. Just dead. Its neck was broken clean. It had been placed on the porch right by the door. Its legs were tucked under its body like it had been positioned deliberately. No blood, no mess. Just sitting there like some kind of offering. I buried it out back and stayed inside all day. That night, I heard footsteps again, closer this time, and this time I knew it wasn't an animal. They stopped right outside the window, where I'd hung a blanket to keep the cold out. The light from the fire flickered behind me. I could feel someone standing just inches away on the other side of that wall. I raised the rifle and waited. I didn't move. I barely breathed, but the footsteps didn't start again. There was no knock, nothing. They just stood there. Minutes passed. Then they were gone. Day 6 was quiet. Too quiet. No animal sounds. No wind. Even the squirrels that used to run across the roof in the morning were gone. I didn't find any more tracks or dead animals, but I did see something new. A rope hanging from one of the trees near the shed. A short length of dirty rope, tied into a noose, swinging gently. I hadn't put it there. Martin didn't keep anything like that lying around, and it looked old, weathered, frayed, like it had been sitting in the dirt for years before someone dug it up and strung it from the tree. I cut it down and threw it into the fire. That night, I moved the cot against the door. I turned off the generator and stayed in the dark with the rifle in my lap. I didn't sleep. I listened, and just before dawn, I heard it again. Footsteps, slow, circling the cabin. They stopped near the shed this time. I leaned against the wall and peered out the side window. There was just enough moonlight to see someone standing in the trees. They weren't moving, They were facing the cabin. Tall, thin, shirtless, or maybe just wearing something tight and dark. Their skin looked pale. They didn't have shoes on. They were just standing there, watching. I stayed frozen, not even daring to blink. After a minute, they stepped back into the trees and vanished. I left the next morning. I packed everything fast, tossed it all into the back of my car, and didn't even bother shutting off the fireplace or securing the generator. I drove down the trail faster than I should have, hitting every bump and pothole along the way. The trees seemed to close in tighter the farther I got. When I hit the paved road, I didn't stop until I saw other houses. Civilization, people, cell service. I never went back to the cabin. Martin called me a week later. He said everything was fine when he got home. Nothing was broken or missing. No scratches, no dead animals, no weird footprints. He said maybe I was just stressed, that being alone in the woods can mess with your head. I didn't argue. I didn't tell him about the man in the trees or the noose or the dead rabbit on the porch. I didn't want to think about it anymore. But sometimes, at night, I still hear those slow, steady footsteps in my head. I still see the outline of that man, standing silently among the trees, barefoot, watching. And I wonder how long he'd been there, how long he'd been waiting, and why he never came inside. My name's Tom Halvorson. I live in a small town just outside of Duluth, Minnesota. This happened in 2013. I was 38 at the time. I worked in carpentry and ran a small home repair business with a buddy I'd known since high school. It wasn't big money, but it paid the bills and gave me time to do what I really loved, hunt. Hunting was more than a hobby to me. I grew up in the woods with my dad and uncle, learning how to track deer, clean them, and survive out in the cold. After Dad passed away in 2006, I stopped going out for a while. Then slowly I got back into it. By 2013, I was going every fall. That year, my cousin Shane offered me a chance to use his hunting cabin up north, about 2 hours past Grand Rapids, near a place called Effie. I hadn't seen him in a while. He'd moved down to Iowa and wasn't using the place anymore. He told me it had no power, no running water, and hadn't been visited in over a year. But the structure was solid, and the property backed up to a huge section of state forest. Deer were all over the area. I jumped at the offer. I packed up my .30-06, some food, a camp stove, my sleeping bag, and everything I'd need for a 5-day solo trip. My plan was to leave on a Thursday and come back Monday afternoon. I wanted the peace and quiet more than anything. The first sign that something was wrong came on the drive-in. There's a gravel road that cuts off Highway 5 and runs about 11 miles into the forest. Shane's cabin is tucked away down an overgrown trail that splits from that road around mile 9. I was driving my old Dodge Ram with all-terrain tires, so I wasn't worried about the rough ground. But that road, it felt different than I remembered. I'd been there once years ago when Shane still used the place, and the trail had felt remote then. Now it felt abandoned. I passed 2 old trucks parked in the brush about 3 miles in. They looked like they hadn't moved in years. The windows were fogged, and the bodies were covered in pine needles and dirt. No license plates, just sitting there, as if someone drove them in and walked off. At the 9-mile mark, I slowed and turned onto the trail leading to the cabin. It was tight, barely wide enough for my truck. Trees scraped both sides, and low-hanging branches smacked the windshield. I drove about half a mile before the cabin came into view through the trees. It was a single-story wooden structure with a tin roof, maybe 30 feet wide. The wood was weathered gray, and the porch sagged in the middle. The front steps were warped, and a tree had fallen close to the shed out back. But overall, it was still standing. I parked and got out. The air was dead quiet. Not even birds. just the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. I unlocked the door with the key Shane mailed me, stepped inside, and took a long breath. It smelled like mildew and old wood. Dust hung in the air. The cabin had one main room, a small kitchen area, a table, and a bed in the corner. There was a wood stove near the back wall, a stack of chopped firewood beside it. No lights, of course, just windows, and they were streaked with grime. I unpacked, set up the stove, and lit a fire. As the heat filled the cabin, the smell changed from mildew to something more like wet bark. I swept the floor, which had mouse droppings and leaves scattered near the door. There was a trail of little paw prints running from the stove to the bed. Mice had clearly made themselves at home. Still, I didn't mind. It was better than being surrounded by people. That first night, I sat out on the porch with a thermos of coffee and listened to the forest. The sky was dark, no moon, just stars poking through the treetops. Around midnight, I heard something moving in the woods. It wasn't a deer. Too slow, too heavy. I sat still and listened. Whatever it was, it walked in a wide arc around the cabin, maybe 50 or 60 yards out, crunching leaves, a few broken branches, then silence. I stayed up for another hour, rifle across my lap, just in case. But nothing came close. Eventually, I went back inside, bolted the door, and slept. The next morning, I got up before sunrise, made coffee on the propane stove, and headed out to hunt. The forest here was dense. Pines and birch trees grew thick, and the underbrush was waist-high in some places. I picked a spot on a slight rise about half a mile east and set up behind a fallen tree. By 9 a.m., I saw 3 deer, 1 doe, 2 younger bucks. I shot one of the bucks, clean shot through the lungs. It dropped, kicked for a second, and went still. I cleaned it right there, wrapped the meat in game bags, and hauled it back to the cabin. I spent most of the day processing the deer, smoking some of the meat over the fire pit out back, and salting the rest. I kept the heart and liver in a cooler with ice packs and buried it under the cabin's shade. That evening, I hiked a bit farther to scout. I found a trail leading north, a narrow game path with fresh tracks. Oddly, I also saw boot prints. They were recent, maybe a day or 2 old. Large, wide-soled boots like what you'd wear in the oil fields or logging. But there was no logging here, no oil either, just trees and state land. Still, I figured it was a hiker, maybe someone passing through or staying in another cabin nearby. That night, I cooked the liver with onions and potatoes, ate on the porch again. Around 10 p.m., I heard it again, that movement in the woods. Same pattern, heavy steps, wide arc, never came close, just paced around the edge of the tree-line. I didn't sleep much. By the 3rd day, the unease was growing. I went out to hunt again but couldn't focus. I kept looking over my shoulder, waiting to see someone standing behind a tree. I didn't see a single deer that morning, just more boot prints, more than yesterday, and heading toward the cabin's direction. I followed them for a bit. They weaved in and out, sometimes doubling back, sometimes leading into dense brush where no trail should go. At one point, I found a small clearing with a pile of bones. At first, I thought it was a deer someone else had killed and left behind. But the bones were too small, and the skull, what was left of it, looked different. It wasn't human, but it wasn't a deer either. Maybe a dog, maybe a coyote, but the way they were stacked, like someone had arranged them into a little tower, that made my skin crawl. I backed out and went straight back to the cabin. The door was open, not all the way, just a crack, enough to see the blackness inside. I know I locked it when I left. I pulled my rifle up, stepped slowly onto the porch, and nudged the door with the barrel. Creaked open. Nothing moved. The place looked the same. Stove cold, bed untouched, gear all still there. But something was off. The cooler where I kept the liver and heart was open. The plastic bag was gone. The ice packs were on the floor, half melted. The front window had a smudge, like a handprint, but not quite. It was smeared and wide, more like someone pressed their face against the glass. I packed everything important that night: meat, gear, ammo. I was going to leave in the morning. Something wasn't right, and I wasn't about to find out what. That night, I didn't sleep. I kept the fire going, rifle across my knees, and every few minutes I'd check the window. At 2:17 a.m., I heard something scrape the back wall of the cabin. Not an animal, not a branch, something deliberate, like fingernails across wood. Then silence. I waited for hours. Nothing came back. Around sunrise, I stepped outside. The back wall had 3 deep scratches running from top to bottom, maybe 4 feet long each. They were fresh. I got in the truck and left. But the trail out, it wasn't the same. Branches blocked the path. Not fallen, placed, like someone dragged tree limbs across the road and laid them in a pattern. I had to get out 3 times to move them. The last one had a deer skull tied to it with twine. The eyes were missing. The jaw was gone. Just the skull, facing my truck like it was watching. I didn't stop again until I hit the main road. I drove all the way back to Duluth without pausing. Didn't even pee. I told Shane about it. He didn't believe me. Said the cabin was probably being squatted in by meth heads or weird loners. Told me he'd send someone up to check. But he never did. A month later, I saw on the local news that a hiker had gone missing in that same forest. 2 weeks after that, another hunter reported their camp ransacked. No sign of who did it. No tracks. Just torn tents, missing food, and a gutted deer left hanging from a tree by its hind legs, like a warning. I never went back. That cabin is still out there, sitting empty, surrounded by trees. Maybe someone lives near it now. Maybe it's abandoned for good. But I'll never step foot near it again. Some places aren't meant for people. Some places the woods keep for themselves. And if you ignore the signs, they'll show you exactly why. It was late October when I decided to drive up north to my uncle's old hunting cabin near Ely, Minnesota. I needed a break. Work was getting to me, the city noise was getting to me, and honestly, I just wanted to clear my head for a few days. My uncle, Ron, hadn't used the cabin in over a year. He'd moved down to Arizona after his knees gave out, and he couldn't handle the winters anymore. But the cabin still stood. Still had the essentials, still had a working wood stove, and more than enough firewood to keep me warm for a few days. I was 33, single again after a pretty rough breakup, and tired of staring at the same apartment walls. I packed up my old Ford Explorer with a couple days worth of food, some water, and a few small tools. I brought my .308 just in case I spotted a deer, and a .45 for side carry. It was just habit from years of growing up in rural Minnesota. The drive took nearly 5 hours, and by the time I turned off the main road onto the gravel logging path, the light was fading fast. That stretch always felt eerie, with trees leaning in so close that the branches scraped the side of the vehicle. Even though I'd driven it a few times before, I still felt uneasy every time. You don't see many people up there. No cell service. No neighbors within miles. If something went wrong, you were on your own. The cabin appeared through the trees like it always did, low-roofed, built from dark logs, and sitting about 30 feet off a small lake. The windows were still boarded up from last winter. I parked the Explorer out front and just sat there for a moment watching the tree line. Everything was quiet. I got the boards off the door, unlocked the padlock, and stepped inside. The air was stale, but otherwise, everything looked about how I remembered it. One main room with a wood stove in the corner, a little kitchenette with a propane stove, and a cot against the back wall. There was a separate outhouse about 30 yards behind the cabin, just out of sight from the porch. I lit the lanterns, got a fire going, and heated up a can of chili. That first night was quiet. I read for a bit, wrote in a small notebook I brought, then turned in early. The cot was stiff, but I was used to worse. The woods were dead silent. No wind, no animal sounds, just silence. Almost too much silence. Sometime during the night, I woke up to the sound of twigs snapping. At first, I figured it was a deer or maybe a raccoon rummaging around. I grabbed the flashlight and shone it out the small front window, but didn't see anything. Still, I couldn't shake that feeling. I left the flashlight on the little shelf by the bed and drifted off again. The next day, I spent the morning stacking some firewood, checked the old fishing pole, and even hiked down the trail behind the cabin that led to the ridge. That trail used to be clear, but now it was half overgrown. Something about that path made me feel on edge. I didn't stay out there long. By evening, the clouds rolled in thick, and it started to drizzle. I stayed inside, cooking up some instant rice and beans, then sat by the fire. I was halfway through an old paperback when I heard something. Not twigs this time. It was heavier, like a footstep. I held my breath, stood up, and listened. Nothing. I waited a full minute, then walked to the window and peeked out. Still nothing. I told myself it was probably a branch falling or an animal stepping wrong. But I took the .45 off the table and slid it into the holster anyway. Better safe than sorry. The third day was cold, cloudy, and quiet. I didn't feel like hiking. Something about the atmosphere just felt off. I kept glancing out the windows, checking the tree line, and even circled the cabin a few times to reassure myself. Nothing seemed disturbed, but there were boot prints in the mud around the back of the cabin. Not mine. I hadn't walked out there since arriving, and they weren't old either. Still fresh, maybe from that morning. The pattern wasn't familiar, and it looked like someone had walked halfway around the building, then turned back toward the woods. No reason to panic, I told myself. Maybe a hunter, maybe someone passing through, but they'd have to come down the same road I did, and I didn't see any other tire tracks on the gravel. And that road only went one way, straight to the cabin. There wasn't any reason for anyone to be out there unless they were coming specifically to this place. I didn't sleep much that night. I kept the lantern on low, gun next to the bed, boots on. Around 2 a.m., I heard it again, movement outside. This time, slower, deliberate. I crept to the window, heart pounding. The fire had died down, but there was still a soft glow that let me see a bit of the porch. Someone was standing just out of view. I froze. They didn't knock, didn't try the door, just stood there. I couldn't see a face or figure clearly, just a shadowy form. After a minute, they moved back off the porch and disappeared into the dark. I stayed awake until daylight. I wanted to leave right then, but the Explorer's battery was dead. I don't know how, it had been fine, no lights left on. It just wouldn't turn over. I checked the terminals, tried again. Nothing. That's when I really started to panic. No power, no cell signal, no one for miles. I grabbed the rifle, locked the cabin door, and pulled the boards from the windows back inside so I could re-nail them from within. Every window, every possible point of entry. I set up a few small makeshift noise traps outside, tied up cans and fishing line across the main trail and around the back path. Anything to give me warning. I barely ate that day, spent most of it sitting inside with the rifle on my lap. Around noon, it started to rain again. Heavy this time, with thunder rolling in the distance. It didn't stop until nightfall. Then, everything went quiet again. Around 10 p.m., one of the noise traps rattled. Then another. I raised the rifle and waited. No sounds, no footsteps, nothing after that. Just the wind. I stayed seated, watching the door, ears straining for any sound. At 3 a.m., the doorknob turned. It actually turned. I raised the rifle, heart in my throat. The door didn't open. It was bolted, and I'd reinforced it earlier. But whoever was out there had tried. They didn't knock, Didn't say a word, just left. I didn't sleep at all after that. By morning, I was a mess. My hands were shaking. My stomach felt like it was tied in knots, and my mouth was dry. I had to get out of there. I packed everything into my bag, slung the rifle over my shoulder, and started walking down the gravel road. It was 10 miles back to the county road where I might be able to flag someone down. I didn't care. I just needed to get away from that cabin. I hiked fast, checking behind me every few minutes. The forest was silent again. I didn't see any tracks, didn't hear anything, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The farther I got from the cabin, the better I felt. By late afternoon, I reached the county road. About half an hour later, a pickup finally came by, and the guy gave me a lift to the nearest town. I filed a report with the sheriff. He was polite but clearly skeptical. Said it was probably just a local squatter or someone who didn't know I was staying there. When I asked about running prints from the door or the boot tracks, he just shrugged. Said there was no real crime committed. I never went back for the Explorer. I had it towed a few weeks later. I never went back to that cabin either. My uncle eventually sold the place to some guy from out of state. Haven't heard what became of it since. I think about that trip more often than I'd like. I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't bolted the door that night, or if I hadn't woken up, or if I'd ignored the prints. I don't know who was out there, but I know this much. Someone knew I was alone. Someone was watching, and they had no intention of introducing themselves. Not with words, anyway. Since then, I haven't camped alone. Haven't gone deep into the woods by myself. The silence isn't peaceful anymore. It's a warning. And when I look back on it now, I don't think it was random. Whoever it was, they were waiting for someone like me. And next time, they might not wait so long. It was 2016. I had just turned 33 and was in a rut I couldn't quite shake. My job as a regional truck dispatcher in Colorado Springs wasn't cutting it anymore, and my long-term relationship had ended the year before. I'd let myself go a bit, put on some weight, slept odd hours, lived mostly on boxed food and whatever fast food I could grab after work. That kind of hollow routine where the days just blend together. My cousin Kyle, who I hadn't spoken to much in the last few years, called me out of the blue one night. He worked border patrol in southern Arizona and had a hunting cabin in a remote stretch of land west of Nogales. We were close when we were kids. He was the one who taught me to shoot and skin small game, and he was always the brave one between us. He said he hadn't been up to the cabin in a few months and wanted someone to check in on it. He knew I was struggling, and maybe he figured I needed an excuse to get out of town for a while. I said yes. I had a couple weeks of unused vacation time, so I took them. I packed up my aging Subaru, bought a couple of cheap camping supplies from a local shop, grabbed my .38 from the lockbox, and hit the road. No real plan, just needed to breathe different air for a while. The drive took about 13 hours. The closer I got to the Arizona border, the more empty everything started to feel. Fewer gas stations, long, flat stretches of road where the only thing you'd pass for miles was a rattlesnake or some dead jackrabbit roasting on the asphalt. It was late March, but the heat had already started to bite. I stopped in a small town called Sonoita to fill up, then drove another 40 minutes down a washboard road that rattled my fillings loose until I reached the turnoff Kyle had told me about. The cabin sat in a clearing maybe 5 miles off the main dirt road. It was surrounded on all sides by low mesquite trees, dry riverbeds, and sunburnt boulders. This was no tourist getaway. It had no running water, no cell reception, and no electricity unless you got the small generator running. But it was sturdy and clean. He'd left some food in the cabinets, some jugs of water, a first aid kit, and a couple of cots. Enough to make it livable for a few days. I arrived in the late afternoon, popped the lock, and dropped my bag on one of the cots. Inside, it smelled faintly of dry wood, dust, and something faintly metallic, probably old tools or rusting nails. The place wasn't big. One main room with 2 cots, a table, a wood stove, and a shelf with some old field guides. The only other room was a small bathroom with a composting toilet and a cracked mirror. Outside the cabin, the silence was total. No cars, no hum of distant roads, just wind and dry grass scraping against itself. Every now and then, I'd hear a lizard skitter under a rock or the wings of a bird flapping high above me. There was no real trail to or from the place, just a set of faint tire ruts where Kyle's truck must have come in and out months ago. I spent the first day just settling in. I tested the generator, which roared to life after a few tries. It powered a single bulb over the table and gave enough juice to charge my phone if I needed it, but with no signal, there wasn't much point. I lit a small fire in the ring outside, cooked up some canned chili, and let the quiet wrap itself around me. That night, I slept okay. I locked the door behind me, placed the .38 under the cot, and lay there listening to the wind. The stars were like nothing I'd seen before. Sharp, endless, and cold. You forget how alive the sky looks when you get away from city lights. The next morning, I went walking. There wasn't much else to do. I had brought a journal and a couple of books, but I was restless. I wanted to move, to sweat, to feel something other than what I'd been feeling in my apartment the last year. I followed a dry riverbed north until I found a low ridge with a good view of the valley. The land stretched forever, yellow and tan and dry, broken only by rocks and the occasional twisted tree. It was beautiful, but in a hard, indifferent way. Around late afternoon, I started back. That's when I saw the first sign something wasn't right. Just beyond the tree line to the west of the cabin, maybe 200 feet out, I spotted something on the ground. It looked like a dead animal, maybe a coyote. Its fur was patchy, skin stretched tight over bones, and it was lying in an unnatural position, almost like it had been dropped there from a height. I didn't get too close. Something about it made my skin crawl. I circled wide and headed back. That night, the wind picked up. The generator sputtered and died just after sunset. So I sat in the dim light of my lantern and read. I kept hearing things, little cracks and rustles just beyond the windows. I chalked it up to deer or javelinas, but something about the pattern of movement was strange. It didn't feel random. It felt like something was circling, staying just out of sight. I got up once and went to the window, staring out into the dark. Nothing, just empty desert and waving shadows. Then I heard a thud, not a loud one, but enough to make me freeze. Came from the back wall of the cabin, near the bathroom. I grabbed the gun, heart pounding. Waited, nothing else. No movement, no second sound. After maybe 10 minutes of standing there like an idiot, I chalked it up to a tree branch or something falling off the roof and went back to the cot. But I didn't sleep much. The next morning, I went out back. There were no branches on the roof. Nothing on the ground that would have made that sound. But there were tracks. At first, I thought they were animal prints. The soil was hard, but there were faint marks, impressions that didn't match anything I could place. They were too long, too narrow, and too flat to be coyote or javelina. And they didn't have the deep pad marks that cats leave. They looked wrong, almost human, but the spacing was off, too far apart. Whoever made them was either running or very tall. I didn't know what to make of them. I took a photo with my phone, even though I knew I couldn't send it to anyone. I followed the tracks for a little while, but they vanished into the rocks after about 50 yards. I came back, feeling uneasy. I kept the gun on me the rest of that day. Every time the wind shifted or a bird darted out of the brush, I jumped. That afternoon, I noticed something else. One of the water jugs, one I hadn't opened, was half empty. It was still capped, but the seal looked broken. I hadn't touched that one since I arrived, and I was sure it had been full. I didn't sleep that night, I stayed up in the cot, gun on my chest, lantern burning low. At some point past midnight, I heard the sound again. A thud, this time followed by a low scraping sound, like something dragging along the wall. Then silence. I didn't move. I just lay there, eyes locked on the door. Then I heard something I'll never forget. Breathing. Not mine. Not loud, but close. It was coming from just outside the wall. Deep, slow, steady breathing. Like someone trying to stay quiet but too close to control it fully. It lasted maybe 30 seconds. Then nothing. I don't remember falling asleep. I must have passed out from sheer tension. I woke up just before dawn and bolted outside. There were more tracks, this time circling the cabin. They weren't quite the same as the day before. Some were deeper. Some almost seemed like hands. Not paws. Hands. Long fingers pressing into the dirt like claws. I felt sick. I packed my things that morning. I told myself I was just being paranoid, that it was probably a mountain lion or a bear or some local animal I wasn't familiar with. But I didn't believe it. Not really. I planned to leave just after lunch. I wanted one last look around before I went, mostly to convince myself that it was nothing. I walked the edge of the clearing, following a narrow game trail to the east. That's when I saw it. There was something in the trees, standing still, facing me. First, I thought it was a person, but it wasn't. It was too tall, at least 7 feet. Its arms were long and hung too low. It didn't move like a person. It tilted its head, slowly, like it was studying me. I couldn't see its face clearly. It was in the shadow, but I knew it was looking straight at me. I raised the gun. My hand was shaking so badly I nearly dropped it. The thing didn't move, just watched. I backed away, step by step. I didn't turn around until I was back at the cabin door. When I looked again, it was gone. I threw everything into the car, slammed the hatch, and took off. I didn't care about the rattling road or the fact that I nearly tore my front bumper off hitting a ditch. I just wanted to be gone. I made it to the main road in under 30 minutes, speeding the whole way. I didn't stop until I reached a diner near Tucson, where I sat in my car for a full hour trying to breathe. When I told Kyle, he went quiet. Then he said I wasn't the first to see something strange up there. He didn't say more. I never went back. Even now, 9 years later, I can't explain what I saw. I've read about skinwalkers, but I don't believe in legends. What I do believe is this: something was out there, something watching, something that knew I was alone. It wasn't a ghost. It wasn't a demon. It was real, and I don't think it wanted me to leave. I was 37 when I took time off from everything and went north. It was April 2016, and I had just left my job at a haulage company in Leeds after almost 11 years. I didn't quit on bad terms, I just got tired. I'd work days, nights, weekends. I missed birthdays, holidays, and 2 funerals because of that job. After a while, it starts to weigh down on you. One day, I just stopped caring and handed in my notice. No plan. No next step. A friend of mine, Mark, who lived near Carlisle, offered to let me use his family's cabin for a bit. It was way up in Cumbria, about an hour and a half from Keswick. I didn't know the exact location until I punched it into the sat-nav. I remember looking at the route and seeing that most of it was single-lane roads through woodland. No towns, no big villages, just scattered farms and silence. That's exactly what I thought I wanted. The cabin was a squat wooden thing set back from the road, surrounded by mossy trees and stone walls so old they were barely holding together. It looked like it had been forgotten by time. There was a small gravel patch for parking, and beside that a rotted fence with ivy growing through it. No phone signal out there, no Wi-Fi, and I hadn't brought a laptop. Just a few books, my coat, and enough food for a week. I thought I'd use the time to reset, get some sleep, maybe even sketch a bit. I used to be into drawing back in college. The first day and night were fine, quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you feel like your ears are ringing. All I heard were birds and the wind moving through the trees. It was cold even for spring. I kept the fire going in the little wood stove and layered up at night. The water pump creaked and groaned, and the lights flickered if you had too many on. But it was peaceful in that forgotten sort of way. It was the second day that I noticed something. I'd gone for a walk around the nearby woods after lunch. It was just pine and birch trees mostly, with a muddy trail that looped back to the cabin. On my way back, I noticed a section of the undergrowth had been flattened. It wasn't like a deer trail or where people normally walk. It looked fresher, recent, like someone had moved through that spot deliberately. I followed it with my eyes, saw broken twigs and scuffed soil. It led to a cluster of trees about 50 feet away from the trail, and that's when I saw something else. A bit of faded blue cloth was snagged on a branch. It looked like part of a coat or a long dress maybe. I remember standing there for a while, staring at it, trying to make sense of it. I hadn't seen another person since I got to the cabin. No hikers, no farmers, no one. I figured it was just old. Maybe something left behind by a rambler months ago. Still, I didn't like how fresh the trail looked. I turned around and went back to the cabin without touching it. That night, I had trouble sleeping. I kept hearing this light knocking sound, like something tapping the wall outside. The wind was up, so I assumed it was a branch or maybe an animal brushing against the logs. I didn't check. I just stayed in bed and waited for morning. By the third day, the air in the place started to feel wrong. Heavy, like it was pressing in on me. I'd wake up sweaty even though it was cold. I caught myself looking out the window too often, like I expected someone to be out there. I hadn't seen a single car on the road since I arrived. No post, no bin men, nothing. Just the wind and birds and the occasional squirrel on the roof. Then I started noticing the cabin had been touched when I wasn't looking. First, it was small. The broom was leaning on a different wall. The kettle had been moved about a foot from where I left it. My coat had been folded and placed on the table when I'd left it hung over the chair. None of it made sense. I tried to tell myself maybe I was just tired, remembering things wrong, but it kept happening. By the fourth night, the firewood I'd stacked inside was rearranged. The bigger logs were on top, which I never did because they don't catch well that way. On the fifth night, I finally saw her. It was about 2 in the morning. I'd gone to bed early but kept waking up. Around 1, I got up to use the toilet, just an outhouse about 20 feet from the cabin. No lights. I grabbed my torch and went out, breath fogging in the cold. As I came back in, I felt something move near the edge of the trees. Just a shift in the dark. I froze and aimed the torch at the woods. The beam caught something pale and still. She was standing between 2 trees, still as stone. The torch hit her full on, and she didn't blink or move. Her skin looked gray in the light, and her clothes were soaked through, like she'd come up from a river. Long hair, hanging wet over her face and shoulders. She didn't react to the light, just stared at me, or maybe past me. Her arms hung at her sides.
Not witch, no si ver.
I didn't say anything. I didn't move for what felt like a full minute. Then I stepped backward and shut the cabin door. I locked it. I even dragged the table across it. Then I sat on the floor with my back against the bed, torch still on, heart hammering. I didn't sleep that night. Every hour or so I'd crawl to the window and peek out. I never saw her again, but I felt her. The next morning, I searched the woods. There were no footprints where she'd been. No signs of anything. The ground was soft, muddy, but not a single print. I checked the tree where she stood, and the bark was damp like everything else, but no marks. Nothing. That afternoon, I packed my things. I told myself I was overreacting, but I still packed. I planned to leave first thing the next morning, after the roads thawed a bit. I didn't want to risk the tires in the dark, not with all the frost and loose gravel. That night was the longest of my life. I didn't light a fire. I didn't want the glow to give anything away. I stayed in bed, fully dressed, keys in my pocket. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, and at around midnight, I heard the boards creak outside the door. Slow, deliberate steps, one after the other, then silence. Then the doorknob turned, gently, just enough to make a click. It was locked, but it turned again slowly. Then it stopped. I didn't breathe. I didn't move. Then the tapping started. Light taps on the wood, like fingernails, 5 of them, spread out, dragging down the grain of the door. Then silence. I stayed frozen until dawn. When light finally broke, I didn't wait to eat. I grabbed my bag, threw it into the boot, and drove. I didn't even check if the petrol tank was full. I just drove until I hit a proper road, then kept going until I saw a shop and people and noise. I never went back. I didn't tell Mark anything about what happened. I told him thanks and that the place was peaceful and that I appreciated it. He offered it again 2 years later when I lost my brother. I said no, but I still think about her. Not just that night. What sticks with me is how she looked. She wasn't dirty or bloody or wild. She looked like someone who didn't belong there, like she had once but not anymore, like she had been walking that place long after anyone should. A few months later, I did some digging. Quietly, I looked up the land near the cabin, found old maps, some old newspaper stories in an online archive. Nothing useful until I found a mention from 1973 about a missing woman named Lillian Carter. Local. Vanished while walking to her family's land. Last seen wearing a long blue coat. The search was called off after 2 weeks. No body ever found. They listed it as a probable drowning in a nearby reservoir. But that reservoir wasn't even near the cabin. I've thought about it too many times since. I know what I saw. I know how she looked. I know how she stood there in the trees, silent, watching, not moving like an animal or a person, just being there. I know this much. She wasn't lost. Not anymore. That land belonged to her, and she was watching to make sure I remembered that. I have every day. It was late October 2013 when I took a job I should have walked away from the second I heard the details. My name is Mason Wallace, and back then I was 28, just over 5 years into working private security contracts. Mostly low-risk stuff, property checks, escorting shipments, the occasional sit-in with clients worried about threats. I wasn't military, wasn't a cop either. Just another guy who knew how to follow orders and handle a sidearm. That month, I was in southern Colorado, near a stretch of land just west of the San Isabel National Forest. It was empty country, mostly scrubland and pine woods, the kind of place people go to disappear. I'd done a 2-week security run for a retired banker who owned a hunting property out there. Nothing crazy, just keeping an eye on trespassers and making sure nobody got into his sheds or tools. It was easy pay. I just packed up and was about to head out when I got a call from a guy I knew in Arizona named Jake. He was ex-law enforcement, used to work narcotics before going private. He told me he had a client in Colorado who needed quiet assistance with a sensitive situation. He didn't give much detail, just said it was a short job, 3 days max, and paid double my normal rate. I should have asked more questions, but I just finished a quiet contract, had a full tank of gas, and the next job was only 2 hours away. I said yes. Jake gave me the GPS coordinates over the phone. It led me to a narrow service road off Highway 96, maybe 30 miles from the nearest town. The road climbed through pines and rock slopes, barely wide enough for my 4Runner. I drove slow, letting the tires crunch over gravel, the wind picking up around me as I climbed. The sky was pale blue and empty, No houses, no fences, no signs. I didn't pass a single car the whole way up. Eventually, I reached a gate made from rusted chain link, the kind ranchers used to keep livestock from wandering onto the road. The lock was open, just looped through the chain. I pushed through and kept driving another 5 minutes until the trees opened and I saw the cabin. It was larger than I expected. 2 stories, built from rough-cut pine logs, with a metal roof and a small antenna sticking up from the chimney. There was a wide porch in front, a pair of floodlights bolted above the door, and a green pickup parked beside it. It looked more like a lodge than a cabin, the kind of place a group of hunters would rent for a long weekend. The clearing around it was maybe an acre wide, surrounded on all sides by thick woods. I parked off to the side and waited in my car for a bit, just watching. There was no movement. Then, finally, the door opened and 4 men stepped out. I recognized 2 of them from a photo Jake had sent me. A pair of broad, serious-looking guys in black jackets, mid-40s. The other 2 were younger. All of them moved like they'd had some sort of training. One had a duffel slung over his shoulder. Another one carried a satellite phone. They didn't introduce themselves, just gave me a nod and waved me over. I grabbed my gear, just a backpack, my Glock, a flashlight, some gloves, and followed them inside. The interior of the cabin was colder than I expected. The wood stove hadn't been lit. The windows were covered with blackout curtains, and the floor creaked underfoot. There were 2 large rooms on the ground floor, a kitchen and a living area, and a narrow hallway leading to 2 bedrooms. Upstairs was more of the same, another bedroom, a loft, and a half-finished bathroom. There were no family photos, no hunting trophies, no signs of personal life at all. It felt more like a forward operating base than a weekend getaway. One of the men handed me a piece of paper. It had coordinates, a name, and a date, October 23rd, 2 days from then. The name was Kyle Brenner. The oldest guy, who had a gray beard and sharp eyes, made a motion like he was zipping his lips. I got the message. Don't ask questions. That night, they stayed up late, pacing, going over maps, speaking in low voices. I didn't sleep much. I heard boots on the porch every hour or so, someone checking the perimeter. I kept my clothes on, boots at the edge of the bed, Glock under the pillow. The next day was more of the same. They ran through plans, tested comms, checked batteries. No one said anything to me beyond hand signals. I saw one of the younger guys loading something into a false bottom of a cooler. Black zip ties, heavy gloves, a roll of plastic sheeting. My gut started to churn. I knew what this looked like. I just didn't know why it was happening out here. That evening, just after sunset, they called me outside. One of the guys opened a pelican case and handed me a set of binoculars, told me to watch the southern tree line. They didn't speak, just pointed. I climbed into a wooden deer stand about 50 yards out from the cabin and kept watch while they moved around below. An hour passed, then another, and then I saw him. A man, maybe late 30s, wearing a brown jacket and carrying a rucksack, emerged from the trees. He moved slowly, checking his surroundings. He looked tired, wary. He was alone. He didn't see me, but the others had already spotted him. They didn't move toward him, just waited. When the man reached the edge of the clearing, he stopped and crouched near a rock. Looked like he was catching his breath. One of the guys from the cabin approached him carefully, arms out. I saw the man nod. They spoke. Couldn't hear what was said, but then they walked together toward the cabin. I climbed down and met them at the porch. The man's name was Kyle. I only knew that because one of the older men said it when they led him inside. He didn't look dangerous. He looked like someone who hadn't slept indoors in weeks. Dirt on his boots, sunburn on his face, eyes sunken from exhaustion. They brought him into the back bedroom, told me to stay by the front door. After that, I didn't hear anything for maybe 20 minutes. Then one of the younger guys came out, pulled me aside, and handed me a box of latex gloves. Told me to help clean up. When I walked into the room, Kyle was dead. His body was on the floor, face turned away, a dark stain spreading beneath his head. No sign of a struggle. One of the older men was wrapping duct tape around a tarp. The other was peeling off gloves, sweat shining on his forehead. I didn't ask what happened. I didn't need to. They didn't beat him, didn't shoot him. There was a small puncture on his neck. I guess something chemical. Fast, quiet, controlled. I helped wrap the body, sealed it with the others, then helped carry it to the green pickup. They didn't bury him. They just loaded the body into the bed under a false panel, tied it down, and covered it with loose tools and spare tires. They burned the gloves and sheeting behind the cabin that night. The flames crackled for hours, sending black smoke through the pine trees. No one said a word. The next morning, I told them I was done. One of the men, the older guy with the gray beard, pulled me aside and handed me an envelope. It was thick, filled with cash. Told me the job was over. I could go. So I left. I drove for 5 hours straight until I reached a motel in Pueblo, checked in under a fake name, and showered until the hot water ran out. I couldn't stop seeing his face. Kyle, whoever he was. That night, I sat on the bed and stared at the wall, trying to piece it together. There were no badges, no uniforms, no mention of law enforcement, but those men were trained. They moved like a team, not ex-military, more like special ops, but leaner, quieter. I remembered the plastic sheeting, the satellite phone, the duct tape, the way they spoke without words. I searched Kyle Brenner's name online, found a few hits, mostly news articles from a few years earlier. He'd been a whistleblower, worked with a defense contractor in Nevada, filed a complaint about misused funds and illegal surveillance programs. Then he vanished. No follow-up, no interviews, and that's when it hit me. He wasn't a threat. He was a liability. They hadn't brought me in for protection. They brought me in because they needed a fallback. A witness, maybe, or just another name that couldn't be traced back to them. For the next few months, I kept moving. Never stayed in one place longer than a week. Switched phones twice. Used cash. I knew how to disappear. I'd done it before, but they never came after me. No strange cars. No phone calls. Nothing. Just silence. I think they assumed I'd keep quiet, that I'd seen enough to stay afraid. And they were right. I never told anyone. Not the cops, not Jake, not even my brother. I just kept it locked away, like a bad dream that never ended. But there's something I didn't expect. A year later, I was working a job in Montana, guarding a private mining operation. Middle of nowhere. A guy came through with a delivery, said he was a contractor from New Mexico. Looked familiar. Gray beard, sharp eyes. He didn't say anything to me, just gave me a long look as he passed. I think it was a message, a reminder that they were still out there, that they hadn't forgotten, and that if I ever spoke, they'd know. So I kept my mouth shut. Still do. But sometimes, late at night, I remember Kyle's face, the tired eyes, the silence in that cabin, the way the trees swallowed the smoke. And I wonder how many more bodies ended up in pickups, driven out into the woods, never seen again. That's the part that stays with me. Not the money, not the fear, the silence. I had never thought much about building a cabin, let alone doing it alone in the middle of nowhere. But there I was, a few hours into the evening, standing in front of a half-finished cabin I had been working on for the past few weeks. It was meant to be a retreat, a place to get away from the world, clear my head, and maybe even figure out the next steps in my life. I had always been good with my hands, so when the idea struck me one summer evening, it felt like a good challenge. The rain started falling heavily as I hammered the last nails into the roof of the cabin. The sky had turned dark hours earlier, and the storm had come without warning, sweeping in like a shadow, fast and unrelenting. I couldn't help but feel a sense of unease as the first raindrops hit the back of my neck. The wind howled through the trees, making them sway like giant shadows in the dark. The forest surrounding the cabin felt like it was alive, whispering its secrets in the wind. I could hear the constant rustle of the trees and the occasional snap of a twig under the force of the wind. I had been working at the cabin for days, mostly alone, save for the occasional visit from a friend or two who helped me with the heavier lifting. But now, with the storm raging, I was completely alone. The sound of the rain and wind drowning out the quiet hum of nature I had grown used to. By the time I finished securing the roof, I was drenched. My clothes clung to my skin, and my breath came out in short gasps, my body shivering despite the physical exertion. I looked at the cabin, the wooden walls just starting to take shape, and felt a brief moment of pride. It wasn't much, just a small cabin with a fireplace, a few windows, and a door that could be locked. But it was mine. With the storm intensifying, I decided it was time to head inside. My boots squelched in the muddy earth as I made my way to the small door, my hand gripping the handle with a sense of relief. The warmth of the cabin greeted me as soon as I stepped inside. I closed the door behind me, locking it firmly, and then let out a deep sigh. The silence inside was almost deafening compared to the roar of the storm outside. I had brought a small camping stove with me, so I set it up near the fire pit and started making some food. It wasn't anything fancy, just a simple meal, but it was enough to take the edge off my hunger. I couldn't help but feel a little on edge, the storm outside making everything feel so isolated. I had grown up in a small town, but the deep woods where my cabin stood were unlike anything I had ever experienced. There was something eerie about being in the forest at night, especially with the rain coming down in sheets, the trees thrashing in the wind, and the occasional distant crash of thunder. I felt like the whole forest was watching me, waiting for something. I brushed off the feeling, telling myself it was just the isolation playing tricks on my mind. After all, I had done this before. I had gone camping countless times, spent nights in the woods, and never felt this level of unease. But tonight felt different. The rain kept falling harder, the wind picking up strength, rattling the small windows in the cabin. The fire I had built flickered weakly, as if even it was struggling against the force of the storm outside. I pulled a wool blanket from my bag and wrapped it around myself as I sat down on the small cot in the corner of the cabin. The storm had become a constant roar, the rain hitting the roof in an almost rhythmic pattern. It was soothing at first, but then I started to notice the silence in between the bursts of rain. The trees outside had stopped moving as violently, and for a brief moment, I thought I heard something. A faint rustling, like the sound of someone walking just outside the cabin. I froze, my eyes darting to the window, half hidden by the thick rain. There was nothing, just the dark forest, the trees bending under the weight of the storm. I told myself it was nothing, just the wind or the storm playing tricks on me. But still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching. The sound came again. This time, it was unmistakable. A distinct crunch of something heavy stepping on a twig or a branch. My heart skipped a beat, and I stood up, my legs weak as I made my way to the window. I peered out into the dark forest, the rain now falling in torrents, blurring everything in sight. There was nothing. I stared into the darkness for what felt like hours, trying to make sense of what I had heard. But all I saw was the endless expanse of trees, each one seeming more foreboding than the last. I shook my head, trying to push away the unease that had begun to settle deep in my chest. There was no one out there. It was just the storm messing with my mind. But then I saw it, a figure, barely visible through the rain, standing at the edge of the clearing near my cabin. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, a shadow cast by the trees or the rain. But as I blinked and focused harder, I realized it was a person, a tall figure, standing perfectly still, almost as if they were waiting for something. The figure's outline was blurred, but there was something unnerving about the stillness, the way they didn't move, despite the storm raging around them. I quickly backed away from the window, my heart pounding in my chest. Was it someone from the nearby town, someone caught in the storm? Or was it something else? I didn't know, but I couldn't just sit there. The figure wasn't moving, but it was still there. I grabbed my flashlight, turned it on, and cautiously opened the door, stepping out onto the small porch. The rain hit me instantly, the cold water soaking through my jacket. I squinted into the darkness, but the figure was gone. The clearing was empty. I stood there for a few moments, the only sound the relentless patter of the rain against the earth. There was no sign of anyone. I didn't know what to think. My mind raced, each possibility more unsettling than the last. Had I imagined it? Was I just exhausted from the work I had been doing all day? I stepped back inside, locking the door behind me once again. I sat down on the cot, my mind racing. There had to be a reasonable explanation, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The storm continued its unrelenting assault on the cabin, but it was no longer the sound of the rain that kept me awake. It was the thought of someone out there, watching. The hours dragged on, each second stretching longer than the last. I tried to focus on something else, but the sound of my own breathing seemed too loud in the silence. My eyes darted to the window every few minutes, scanning the darkness outside, but there was nothing, just the storm. It wasn't until late in the night that I finally heard it again. The faintest of footsteps. This time I wasn't imagining it. I could hear the crunch of twigs, the soft rustling of leaves. Whoever was out there was moving slowly, deliberately. My heart raced as I grabbed the flashlight again, rushing to the door. I opened it, stepping out into the rain once more. But this time I wasn't going to stand there like an idiot waiting to see what would happen. I moved toward the edge of the clearing, shining the light into the trees. Nothing. But then I heard a voice. It was faint, barely audible above the sound of the storm, but it was unmistakable. A voice calling my name. I froze. I knew that voice. It was my friend's, the one who had helped me with the cabin last week. Jason, are you out there? The voice called again, much clearer this time. Relief flooded through me as I rushed toward the sound. I couldn't see him yet, but I could hear him moving through the underbrush. It was him, just caught in the storm. I was about to shout when something stopped me. There was a strange, guttural laugh, a sound that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. It wasn't my friend's voice. I turned and ran. My legs felt like they were moving through thick mud as I sprinted back to the cabin, my heart pounding in my ears. I reached the door, slammed it shut, and locked it, gasping for breath. I looked out the window again, but there was no sign of anyone. The storm raged on, but the feeling of being watched never left. I spent the rest of the night huddled in the corner of the cabin, flashlight in hand, waiting for morning to come. And when the sun finally rose, it brought with it a sense of relief. But the memory of the night, the footsteps, the strange laughter, and the figure in the rain stayed with me. I never saw the person again, but I knew one thing for sure. Whatever was out there in the woods, it wasn't human, and I would never go back to that cabin again. The cabin was supposed to be a place of peace, a break from the chaos of the city, a quiet retreat where I could clear my head. But that first night, the quiet was something else. Felt wrong. The trees swayed outside, their branches creaking in the wind, and the walls of the cabin seemed to groan under the weight of silence. There was something about it, something deep in my gut, that made me uneasy. I'd rented the place for a week in late autumn. The leaves had turned that deep orange, and the air was crisp but not yet freezing. It was perfect for what I needed: solitude. I wasn't going to do anything special. No plans, no obligations. Just a cabin in the middle of nowhere, far enough from the nearest town that I wouldn't have to see another person unless I chose to. The cabin was old, built sometime in the 60s by a man who had long since passed. It had been maintained but still showed its age. Wooden beams across the ceiling, cracked windows, and creaky floors. The kind of place you expect to find tucked away in a forgotten corner of the woods. I loved it. There was something about the roughness, the imperfections that made it feel like a real escape. I arrived on a Friday afternoon. The sky had been overcast, threatening rain, and when I stepped out of my car, the smell of damp earth and pine filled my lungs. I grabbed my bags, went inside, and started unpacking. There were a few basic amenities, enough to survive a week without too much discomfort. A wood stove for warmth, a small kitchen, a bathroom, and a couple of bedrooms upstairs. I set up my things, got a fire going in the stove, and felt myself starting to relax. The flicker of the flames in the fireplace added a cozy touch to the otherwise empty cabin. I threw together some dinner, nothing fancy, and ate in silence, the wind howling outside. That night, the quiet was almost suffocating. I had left my phone on the charger in the car to ensure I wouldn't be distracted, which made the stillness even more profound. I sat on the couch, staring into the fire, listening to the crackling of the wood. That's when I heard it, the thud. It came from upstairs, a dull sound as though something heavy had fallen. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. The cabin was supposed to be empty. It was just me here. The rental agreement made it clear no one else was around. I stood up slowly, glancing toward the staircase. The thud came again, louder this time, followed by a dragging noise. My skin prickled with a cold sweat. I hadn't noticed when I first arrived, but the stairs creaked slightly when you went up them. They were old, and they hadn't been maintained as well as the rest of the cabin. As I listened, I wondered if the wind had caused something upstairs to fall, maybe a loose board or an old piece of furniture. But that dragging sound? That wasn't the wind. I grabbed a flashlight from my bag, my hands shaking as I flicked it on. My thoughts raced as I crept toward the stairs, one foot in front of the other. The light from the flashlight flickered as I climbed the stairs, casting long, shaky shadows on the wooden walls. The house was dark, save for the soft glow from downstairs. The air felt colder up here. At the top of the stairs, there was a narrow hallway leading to the 2 bedrooms. The dragging noise stopped as I stood there, frozen in place. My breath was shallow, and I could hear the pounding of my heart in my ears. I slowly walked toward the first bedroom. The door was cracked open, but the light from my flashlight barely illuminated the room. There was a shadow on the floor, something large, something dark. My stomach twisted. My throat went dry. I stepped into the room, the beam of the flashlight sweeping across the floor, then up to the bed. At first, I didn't understand what I was looking at. There was a body on the floor, its limbs twisted at unnatural angles, blood smeared across the wooden floor. It was clear this person hadn't died peacefully. The body had been dragged, but I couldn't figure out how or why it ended up here. I stepped back, stumbling over the rug, my foot catching on the edge. The flashlight slipped from my hand and rolled across the floor, its beam still shining. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. There was no sign of anyone alive. No signs of struggle except for the bloodstains and the body itself. The air in the room felt thick, suffocating. I couldn't stay in that room. I turned and bolted downstairs, my heart hammering in my chest. My legs felt weak, and my hands were clammy as I grabbed my phone from the car. I tried to call the police, but of course, there was no signal. The closest town was miles away, and even if I could drive there, I wasn't sure if I could leave the cabin behind. For a few minutes, I just sat in the car, trying to breathe, trying to calm down. But the cabin, that damn cabin, kept calling me back. Something felt off. Something felt unfinished. I had to go back up there. I don't know why I did it, but I grabbed the flashlight again and headed back inside. My thoughts were swirling, my body trembling. I couldn't just leave the body up there, but I couldn't understand how it had ended up in that room. Who had left it there? Why? I crept back up the stairs, and this time I didn't hesitate. I walked straight into the bedroom, my light flickering across the body again. The blood on the floor had dried, but the smell still lingered, metallic, thick. I couldn't stop myself from looking at the body. It was a man, his face pale and twisted in a grimace of pain. His clothes were torn, and there was a deep gash across his throat. But the worst part, there was a small note tucked into his hand. I took a deep breath and forced myself to kneel beside him, careful not to touch anything. I took the note, unfolded it with shaking hands, and read the single line of text scrawled across it. Asterisk, he'll be next. Asterisk, my blood ran cold. The words seemed to echo in my head, drowning out everything else. Who was he, and who had left this message for me? My mind raced, but I couldn't find an answer. This wasn't just some random act of violence, it was personal. I backed out of the room, my legs nearly giving out beneath me. I couldn't stay there any longer. I didn't want to know more. I didn't want to be part of whatever had happened here. But I had to leave. I had to get out of that place. I packed my things quickly, still shaking. The fire had died out by then, and the cold was starting to creep in. I locked the cabin behind me, my hands fumbling as I tried to keep my composure. As I stepped into the car and drove away, I kept my eyes on the road, never looking back. By the time I reached the town, I'd called the police from a payphone. I told them everything about the body, about the note. The investigation took months, but they never found anyone connected to the crime. The cabin was eventually condemned, and I never went back. I don't know who left that body there or why. Maybe it was just a random killing, maybe it was something more. But one thing's for sure. I learned that sometimes the things that seem the safest, like a quiet cabin in the woods, can turn into the most dangerous places of all. It was late September 2019 when I found myself behind the wheel of my truck, heading west through a long stretch of two-lane road, cutting through a thick part of forest in northern Minnesota. I was on my way to Grand Rapids, trying to avoid the main highway and just take the scenic route for once. The kind of road where you pass one truck every half hour, and all you see are trees, trees, and more trees, with the occasional mailbox poking out from a gravel drive. I had the day off work, no schedule, and nowhere urgent to be. Just thought a quiet drive might clear my head. The air had that early fall crispness to it, cool enough to need a light jacket, but not cold. Leaves had already started turning gold and deep red, some already carpeting the edges of the road. The sky had been gray since morning, and it looked like rain might come any time. I didn't mind. I liked driving in that kind of weather. No glare, no heat, just the soft hum of tires on pavement and the sound of wind slipping past the cab. I hadn't thought about her cabin in years. Not really. I mean, sometimes it would pop into my head, like when I saw an ad for firewood or someone mentioned going fishing up north, but I hadn't actually pictured the place in a long time. But as soon as I saw that side road, that narrow break in the trees with the old faded green sign reading Red Pine Trail, something in me clicked. I hadn't even realized how close I was to it. Just muscle memory, maybe. The curve in the road, the slope of the ditch, the way the power lines bent up ahead. It all came rushing back like I'd never left. I slowed the truck without thinking and pulled over onto the shoulder. The engine idled low as I sat there, watching the entrance to the trail. I hadn't been down that path in almost 7 years, not since Emma and I had split. She'd gotten the cabin in the divorce, even though I was the one who'd done most of the work fixing it up. I didn't argue. I just didn't want to fight anymore. After all the things we said to each other, I didn't want anything tying us together. Not even a cabin deep in the woods. I told myself I'd never come back. But that day, something pulled me toward it. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was old guilt. Or maybe it was just me being stupid. Whatever it was, I put the truck into gear and turned down the gravel road. The tires crunched over the loose stones, the suspension bumping softly as I rolled past thick pines on both sides. The trees were tighter here than I remembered, like they'd grown in more since the last time I came down. Everything was quiet. No birds, no wind, just the steady rhythm of my tires pushing deeper into the woods. I kept going, checking the mirror now and then, even though I knew nobody was behind me. The road narrowed more as I went. The branches overhead were almost touching in places, and I had to roll down the window to knock a few out of the way as I drove. After a few minutes, I passed the old hunter's shack, still half collapsed, still reeking of mildew and smoke from a chimney that hadn't worked in decades. And then the turn came up, a sharp right, barely noticeable, just like I remembered. I took it slow, and there it was. The cabin sat in the same clearing, hunched between a crooked birch tree and a rusted propane tank that probably hadn't been filled in years. The roof sagged in one corner, and the once green paint on the siding had almost completely peeled off, showing the gray weathered wood underneath. The place looked smaller than I remembered, or maybe it was just older. I parked the truck off to the side of the clearing, turned off the engine, and sat in the silence. The air was colder now. I could feel it coming in through the cracked window. I looked at the front porch, the board still crooked, the screen door hanging half off the frame. For a minute, I thought about just turning around and leaving. I should have, but I got out of the truck. The gravel crunched under my boots as I walked around the front of the cabin. The yard was overgrown, weeds thick and wet from dew, and a few beer cans half sunk in the dirt near the fire pit. I stepped over a rotten log and looked up at the cabin's front window. The curtain was still drawn, the same one Emma had hung up the summer we first bought the place. Faded blue and white plaid. I reached the porch and tried the door. Locked. Not surprising. Emma had always been the cautious type, even out here. I walked around the side of the cabin, past the rain barrel and the old tool shed we used to keep fishing rods and gas cans in. The shed door was gone. Looked like it had been torn clean off the hinges. Inside, it was dark and full of leaves. Nothing left but a tipped-over plastic chair and a few shattered jars of who knows what. It smelled like wet wood and dead insects. I thought about breaking into the cabin, just for a look, just to see if anything had changed. But then I heard something, not loud, just a shuffle, like someone dragging a foot slowly over leaves. I froze, my ears straining, but it was gone. The woods behind the cabin were still. Not even the sound of squirrels. I looked around the clearing. No other vehicles. No bikes, no boot prints in the mud. Just me. I shook it off and told myself it was probably a rabbit or a fox. The place always had critters sniffing around. I went back to the truck and grabbed my flashlight from the glove box. The clouds were thickening, and the light was already starting to dim, even though it wasn't much past 3:30 p.m. I followed the path behind the cabin. Emma used to call it her thinking trail. It looped down to the edge of a small lake, where we'd set up a makeshift dock and a couple of lawn chairs back in the day. I didn't expect to find the dock still standing, but I wanted to see it anyway. The trail was narrower than I remembered, overgrown. Wet leaves clung to my boots as I moved, flashlight in hand. After 10 minutes, I reached the lake. The dock was gone, like I figured, and the chairs had been tossed into the bushes. But there was something else, something I didn't expect. Tarp. A large, dirty blue tarp, half covered in pine needles and leaves, stretched over something long and lumpy near the water's edge. I didn't move for a minute, just stared at it. The air felt still and heavy, like it was holding its breath. I stepped closer. The smell hit me before I even reached it. Sharp, metallic like blood and rot. I pulled the tarp back. It was a deer, or what was left of one. Half-skinned, ribs exposed, eyes gone. The legs had been cut off clean at the joints. Not chewed, cut. There was a red-stained hacksaw lying in the mud nearby. I didn't touch it. I stepped back, heart thudding. Something about it wasn't right. I'd seen dead deer before.
Y de unta.
But this was different. This wasn't a kill left by some hunter. It felt ritualistic, like someone had taken their time with it. Then I saw the boot print, right there, pressed into the mud beside the carcass. A wide sole, deep tread, bigger than mine, fresh. I scanned the woods behind me. Still nothing. I walked backward, retracing my steps up the trail, holding the flashlight tight in my hand. My eyes flicked from tree to tree, every shadow looking like a figure. I didn't run. Not yet. I just moved quickly. I reached the cabin clearing and glanced at my truck. The passenger side door was open. I swear to God I had locked it. I walked slowly toward it, boots dragging through the gravel. The door was open just a crack, enough to see that the glove box was open and my maps had been pulled out and tossed on the seat. I looked around the clearing again. No one. Then I saw it. Something small and shiny on the ground by the open door. A folding knife. Not mine. I picked it up with the corner of my jacket and turned it over. The blade was clean, but the handle was scratched to hell. I tossed it into the truck bed and slammed the door shut. I didn't bother checking if anything was missing. I just got in, locked all the doors, and started the engine. I reversed out of the clearing and turned back onto the gravel road without looking back. The truck bounced hard over the ruts, and branches scraped the sides as I picked up speed. My hands were tight on the wheel, knuckles pale. The trees blurred by. As I reached the main road, I saw something move in the rear view. A figure, tall, dark clothes, just standing at the edge of the trees where the trail met the road. Watching. I didn't stop. I didn't slow down. I just kept driving until the cabin was miles behind me. That night, I didn't sleep. I kept thinking about the deer, the knife, the print in the mud, the figure, and the way the inside of my truck smelled different after I'd been away from it. Like old sweat and oil, like someone had been sitting in it for a while. The next morning, I called the sheriff's department in that county and reported what I saw. I gave them rough directions. They said they'd send someone to check it out. I don't know if they ever did. I never followed up. I never went back. Emma died 2 years later of something unrelated. I found out through a mutual friend. Her cabin was sold off, maybe torn down. Maybe someone else owns that land now. Maybe that trail's overgrown and gone. But sometimes, when I drive through empty woods or park on an old logging road, I still think about that figure in the trees. The quiet, the feeling of being watched. And I remember how I should have just kept driving. I hadn't been on a real break in years. Between work, errands, and the noise of everything around me, I realized I needed to get out. Not a vacation with planes and hotels and crowds. I wanted something quiet. Just me, my dog, and nature. So I rented a small cabin in northern Maine. Real remote. An old woodsman-style place with no Wi-Fi, no cell signal, no distractions. I found it on a back-end listing site for off-grid stays. It looked sturdy and rustic in the pictures. Basic, but enough for what I needed. I drove up with my German Shepherd, Riley. She's 7 years old, loyal as hell, and smart. Real smart. She's the kind of dog that senses things before they happen. I trusted her more than most people. It was late October, so the weather was already turning. The trees were mostly bare, and the sky had that dull, gray look like it was holding back snow. The drive took longer than I thought, about 8 hours from where I lived in central Massachusetts. I arrived at the cabin just before sunset. There wasn't another house for miles. The only thing nearby was a long dirt road that forked off from a state-maintained one. After that, nothing but trees. The cabin was just like in the pictures. Small, single floor with a peaked metal roof. The logs were weathered but solid. It had a small front porch, 2 windows on the front, and a heavy wooden door with an old bolt lock. Inside was bare bones. A twin cot, wood stove, table, and a couple chairs. The bathroom was an outhouse, maybe 20 feet out behind the trees. There was a pump for water and a small generator in the back that powered a single light inside. That was it. No fridge, just a cooler. No stove, just a metal rack over the wood stove. Perfect.
Y unpack it fast.
Riley explored the perimeter, sniffing everything like she always did. She didn't seem bothered. If anything, she was more relaxed than I'd seen her in months. I let her off-leash, knowing she'd stay nearby. She stuck to me like glue anyway. The first night was peaceful, cold but quiet. I made a fire, cooked some canned soup, and laid out my sleeping bag on the cot. Riley curled up beside it. The wind outside moved through the trees with that soft whisper that feels like it's part of the forest. I fell asleep fast, but I woke up in the middle of the night to a sound. It was subtle, not loud enough to startle me fully awake, but just enough to notice. It sounded like dry branches being stepped on. I sat up. Riley was already alert, ears forward, body stiff. She didn't bark. That was strange for her. She always barked at anything unfamiliar. Instead, she stared at the window. I got up slowly, moved toward the small front window, and peeked through. Nothing. Pitch black. I could see my own reflection more than anything outside. I turned off the little lamp and waited for my eyes to adjust. Still nothing, but Riley wouldn't settle back down for a while. Eventually, after about an hour, she laid back down but didn't take her eyes off the front door until the fire burned out. I didn't sleep much the rest of the night. The next morning, I chalked it up to a deer or something. We were in the middle of the woods, after all. I spent most of the day chopping some logs, gathering kindling, and walking the trails with Riley. There was no path, just game trails and flattened brush where animals had passed. Felt good being out there, quiet, no one around. Riley stayed close but roamed more than usual, sniffing and poking her head through branches. By afternoon, I'd covered about a mile out and circled back. I hadn't seen a single soul.
No campers. No hunters.
Not even any old trash or signs of people. Just trees and rocks and silence. I liked it. That was the point. That night, I double-checked the door bolt and kept the hatchet next to my cot, just in case. I also brought Riley's bed closer to mine. She didn't seem nervous, but she was watchful. She'd perk up at any sound. And there were sounds, more than the night before. At around 2:30 a.m., Riley woke me up with a low growl. Not loud, not aggressive, just deep and steady. I froze. Then I heard it. Footsteps. They weren't trying to be quiet. Dry leaves crunching. Slow, heavy steps circling the cabin. One lap around, then another. Then they stopped. Riley was standing now, hackles raised. She still didn't bark, just stared at the door. I grabbed the hatchet and stepped over to the window again. Same thing. Nothing but black. I waited. 5 minutes. 10. Nothing. Then, out of nowhere, a sharp sound. Metal on metal, like something tapping against the generator in the back. I killed the light and stood in the dark. trying to listen. My heart was racing. Riley moved beside me. She was on edge, breathing through her nose hard, like she was trying to track a scent through the wall. I stayed like that for hours. Eventually, it stopped. Or maybe I just got too tired to notice. When the sun finally rose, I stepped outside, hatchet in hand. Footprints, not animal. Boots, one set, leading around the cabin and then back into the woods. They were fresh, too fresh, and big, bigger than mine. I wear a size 11. These had to be at least a 13. Riley sniffed them and growled again, head low. I thought about leaving, but I hadn't seen anyone. I hadn't been threatened. Could have been a hunter who got lost, or someone passing through. I told myself that, but I started keeping the hatchet on me even during the day. On the third day, it got colder. The wind picked up, and the skies stayed gray all day. Riley didn't want to wander far. She kept looking into the woods, tail low, ears shifting constantly. That afternoon, I found something about 200 yards from the cabin. A tree carved with something. Deep gouges, not initials or marks. It looked like someone had used a knife or hatchet to slice long, deep slashes down the bark. About 10 cuts, each about a foot long, all in a row like tally marks. Riley barked at it, which she never does for trees. Then she backed away from it. I stood there for a while, staring at those marks. It wasn't vandalism. It felt deliberate, like a message or a warning. I went back to the cabin early that evening and blocked the front door with one of the chairs under the bolt. I didn't sleep that night. Not really. The fourth night was the worst. At around 1 a.m., I heard something outside again. This time, it didn't circle. It walked right up to the porch. Then I heard wood creak. The front steps. Riley let out a low, sharp growl and stood up. I grabbed the hatchet, turned off the lamp, and waited in the dark. The creaking stopped, then tapping, slow, rhythmic, like fingernails on the wood frame of the door. Top, top, top. I felt frozen. I couldn't move. Riley stood between me and the door, completely still. Then there was silence, a long silence, then fast footsteps running, but not away, around the cabin. I moved to the back window and saw nothing. Then I heard something behind the cabin, metal again. The generator. This time it wasn't just a tap. It sounded like it got kicked. Then silence. I waited until sunrise before opening the door. That day I found something new. Pile of rocks, stacked carefully like a cairn right outside the tree line. It hadn't been there before. 5 stones, flat, placed one on top of the other. At the base, a stick tied with string. Not rope twine, like something handmade. I didn't touch it. Neither did Riley. She just stared at it, tail down. I packed up that afternoon. Fast. I made the 8-hour drive back without stopping. I didn't even turn off the engine when I packed up the car. I left some gear behind, an axe, a pair of boots, some cans of food. I didn't care. I just wanted to leave. I never figured out who was out there. Could have been a local. Could have been someone squatting in the woods. Could have been something worse. I don't know. I didn't report it. There was nothing to report. I wasn't hurt. I didn't see a face. No one broke in. Nothing got taken. But I knew what I saw, what I heard. It was real. Every part of it. Back home, Riley was fine, but she stayed close for weeks. Even in the house, she'd sleep next to the bed, not on her own. I never saw her that jumpy before. As for me, I haven't gone back into the deep woods since. I still hike, still camp, but only in parks or public grounds. Somewhere with other people nearby. Somewhere with cell service. The thing that sticks with me the most isn't the sound or the tapping or the tracks. It's how quiet it was when it stopped. Whoever was out there didn't want to be seen, but they wanted me to know they were there, that they were watching, listening, waiting. And if I hadn't left when I did, I think they might have done more than just tap on the door. Sometimes at night, when it's real quiet, I still hear it. That slow, soft tapping. But it's only in my head. At least I hope it is. The cabin was always meant to be a quiet escape. Just a weekend getaway. I'd spent countless nights working hard in the city, and the thought of spending a few days surrounded by nothing but trees, mountains, and the kind of silence that only the deep woods could offer was exactly what I needed. I had no plans for this trip, just wanted to disconnect, clear my head, and enjoy the solitude. It wasn't a fancy cabin. It wasn't meant to be. It was built by hand by an older couple a few decades ago, tucked away on the side of a mountain, far away from anyone. They'd left it years ago, but the cabin remained, and I rented it out through a local site. I remember the first time I arrived. The road up to the cabin was long and rough, winding up through dense forest. The trees were thick, tall, and old, casting shadows across the narrow dirt road. The place felt remote, isolated, just like I had wanted. As I pulled up to the cabin, my first thought was how peaceful it was. The air was fresh, with the scent of pine and damp earth lingering in the breeze. The cabin was small, made of logs that had darkened with age. A front porch wrapped around one side, and there was a stone chimney sticking up from the roof, promising warmth inside. The sun was setting by the time I unpacked my bags and got the small wood stove going. I wasn't worried about anything. There wasn't much wildlife around here, at least nothing that could cause trouble. I spent the evening unpacking, getting settled, and starting a fire inside to ward off the chill that had started to creep in as darkness enveloped the cabin. I spent the first night in total silence, the kind of silence that felt almost oppressive. I'd heard stories about cabins like this, old, secluded places that felt like they were holding on to secrets, but those were just stories, and I wasn't the kind of person who bought into that kind of nonsense. There was no reason to be scared. The first couple of days passed without incident. I woke up to the sound of birds outside, drank my coffee on the porch while watching the sunrise, and took long hikes through the forest. There were some small creatures that scurried around, the occasional squirrel, a rabbit now and then, but nothing more. The cabin was quiet. The only real sound was the wind rustling the trees and the crackling of the fire at night. But on the third evening, something changed. I had been out on a long hike that day, following a rough trail that led deeper into the woods. I had lost track of time. When I finally made my way back to the cabin, the sun was beginning to dip low, and the woods around me had grown darker. The wind was picking up, howling through the trees, and I noticed how much colder it felt. It was the kind of cold that made your skin tingle and your breath cloud in front of you. I made my way up the dirt path to the cabin, and as I reached the porch, something caught my eye. There, on the edge of the trees just beyond the cabin, I saw movement. It was fleeting, just a shadow darting behind a tree, but it made my heart race. I froze. It was probably nothing, just a deer or some other animal, I told myself, but something about the way it moved made me feel uneasy. It wasn't the usual way animals behaved. There was a purpose in the way it moved, like it was watching me. I didn't think much of it at first. I told myself that I was being paranoid. I went inside, locked the door, and started another fire. But my mind kept wandering back to that fleeting movement I'd seen outside. The darkness seemed thicker that night, heavier. The wind moaned through the cracks in the walls, and the trees creaked as if they were shifting. But still, I stayed in, too tired to be bothered by it. Later, when I went to bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That night, I was woken up by a sound. It wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable. It was the sound of someone moving outside the cabin. Footsteps, the soft crunch of gravel and dry leaves underfoot. I lay still in the bed, listening, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound was too deliberate to be an animal. This was something else, something that seemed to know I was here. I listened for a few more moments, but the sound stopped. I told myself that I was just hearing things, my imagination playing tricks on me, but I couldn't go back to sleep. I lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind howl outside. It wasn't just the wind anymore. I could hear things rustling in the woods, closer than they had been before. The sound of something moving just outside, circling the cabin, like it was looking for a way in. I got up, trying to keep quiet. I grabbed my flashlight and slowly opened the cabin door, stepping out onto the porch. The light from the flashlight barely cut through the darkness, but I shone it across the yard, sweeping it over the ground. Nothing. I waited for what felt like forever, but still nothing. I couldn't hear anything now, and there was no sign of movement. I told myself that I had overreacted. It was probably just a raccoon or some other animal, I thought. I went back inside and locked the door again, but the feeling didn't go away. If anything, it only grew stronger. I didn't know why I felt like someone was out there. Maybe it was the isolation, or maybe it was just the weight of the silence pressing on me. The next morning, I woke up late, exhausted from the lack of sleep. The sky was overcast, and there was a chill in the air. I figured I'd head into town to get some supplies. I needed a break from the cabin, from the weird feeling that had settled over me. As I was loading up my truck, something caught my eye. It was a footprint, a single print in the mud just outside the door. It was too big to be from a bear, too defined to be from any animal I knew. It wasn't a shoe print either, it was something else. A chill ran down my spine as I stood there, staring at it. I looked around, but there was no sign of anyone, no other tracks, just that single print. I didn't know what to do. The logical part of me told me that it was just some kind of coincidence. Maybe it was just someone passing through, someone who had wandered too close to the cabin. But the hair on the back of my neck stood up, and my gut told me that something was wrong. I decided I needed to leave. I started the truck and began to drive down the rough road leading away from the cabin. I kept glancing in my rearview mirror, but there was nothing behind me, no sign of anyone. That was the last time I ever saw the cabin. As I reached the highway, I didn't look back again. The feeling that had started the day I arrived had finally grown into something undeniable. Something wasn't right out there. I didn't know who or what it was, but I wasn't willing to stick around long enough to find out. I didn't tell anyone what had happened. I wasn't sure if they'd believe me, and truthfully, I wasn't sure I believed it myself. But what I do know is this: the cabin wasn't just a place to escape. It was a place that was hiding something, and whatever it was watching me.